Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 8th episode of the Southwestern College podcast. I am here with my colleague, Alejandro Orozco, and he is here with his friend, Marie. And I'm going to pretty much sit out most of this one, but I will be chiming in here and there. But mostly it's going to be a conversation between these two. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Alejandro.
Yeah. Thanks, Luke, for setting this up. And I just want to say to the listeners that the genesis for this podcast came about when my son was watching YouTube and asked me what I would think about this particular speaker who was on there. And I had heard of Jordan Peterson before. So he said, "What do you think about this?" And Jordan Peterson was talking about gender differences and the pay differences. And his argument with this British interviewer was that most gender differences, pay differences, probably owe a lot more to the proclivity of men to take on dangerous work, to work many more hours, to put their families in peril, their health in peril, many other factors, but kind of dancing around the idea that maybe there really are some issues of sexism here. And so I thought, after listening to this clip, I thought, I'm going to ask my friend who was at the epicenter of Big Pharma back in the late 70s and 80s. And so to our audience, I would like to introduce my friend from the Bay Area. We're old friends from high school and college, and her name is Marie Delahaye. So Marie, I'd like to ask you to speak to our listeners a little bit about your background, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for inviting me on this podcast, my first ever podcast. As Alex mentioned, we go way back, went to high school together. After high school, I got a degree in biology, and after some time was able to secure a position first at a small pharmaceutical company, and then I, after a year and a half, went to Genentech, which at that time was the first biopharmaceutical company created based on recombinant DNA technology. And when I started there was the early 80s. And I went on to spend probably 20 years in the biotech space and worked my way up the career ladder. I happened to go into the area of biotech that was considered manufacturing or operations. And that was definitely an area that was very male-dominated. So I've had a lot of experience working in male-dominated areas. More recently, I am working for a software company. And also throughout my experience, I did quite a few career changes. I got a master's in clinical psychology. I've worked for several nonprofits, and I've also worked as a personal development coach. So I have kind of an eclectic career, but I can certainly speak to the experience of working women working their way up, especially, historically during the 80s and 90s. And I'm happy to say that I think some things have changed quite a bit since I was in my 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead and ask me anything.
Sure. And we're really excited to have you here, Marie. Just your background just puts you, gives us a big insight, I think, into this issue, which, is a nationwide conversation. This is, at the heart of a lot of discussions that are going on, probably all over the world. So when I saw this clip and the way that Jordan Peterson characterized the pay inequality between the sexes, I thought, he seems to be dancing around the issue that there could just be one major factor that he's not willing to discuss, and that's just straight up a sense of discrimination or inequality that really is based on gender difference, the sexes. And so his argument about it's really a matter of testosterone, it's a matter of men having much more risk tolerance. He mentions specifically about how men will go to Alaska and lay pipe in the oil fields, when it's 40 below zero, and put up with miserable conditions, things that women, because they are more sensible, would never do. So he attributes these differences to simply the risk factors that men have. We're fighter pilots, and we'll take on very dangerous positions. So what do you say about that in his characterization?
Well, I mean, I think, I just, I don't agree with it. I think he's bringing up, very small numbers of certain kinds of occupations that might be high risk, but that doesn't at all explain the disparity between men and women's income. I don't think that can explain it. And you can look, I've looked at, some stats in preparation for having this discussion. And first of all, one thing to really look at is the rate at which women have increased the number of women that are getting college degrees, which it now surpasses men, in terms of getting college degrees. And so historically, of course, women used to not be in large numbers in the workforce except in certain kinds of professions, but that has changed a lot over the past decades as more, there's economic reasons for this, in that there was a time in the 50s when families could survive on one income. That doesn't seem to be the case for most parts of this country. But even beyond that, I was actually reflecting about the fact that my mom was also a working mother, and maybe that is not the case as much. Certainly for my peers, their moms worked. I think it was more 50-50 whether moms worked when we were kids. But I think nowadays, our kids obviously are used to having working moms, and it's just there's a lot more percentage of women in the workforce than there ever has been. Yet the pay disparity continues, in every single field. There's not a field where women are making as much as men, and there probably are certain companies that are really working on this. In fact, I work for a large software company that has software that manages things like compensation, and in fact, they're doing a big effort to try to get customers to look at bias in the whole reward system, because quite honestly, when you move up in terms of salary, a lot of salary is determined by, quite honestly, confidence in asking for larger salaries. And that is an area where men, I think, tend to be more confident.
Right.
Making the demands.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson actually mentions that specifically, that there's a quality called agreeableness. And because women, according to him, tend to be more agreeable, more collegial, I guess, more community-based, I guess. They tend to be more agreeable,
more compassionate,
more compassionate, and men tend to dispense with that virtue and will be more aggressive.
Yeah. But how it's a double-edged sword for women, because as soon as you assert yourself, there's a lot of labels that get thrown on women. And you see this a lot in the public sphere around politicians, for instance, women politicians. If you get a little demanding, a little bit less pleasant, there's a lot of characterizations.
And blowback.
Yeah. So it's a very fine-edged sword for women moving up into more powerful positions, leadership positions, in terms of, if they were to act like a man, that would blow back on them.
Yeah. So what do you attribute these differences that you and I probably would easily agree on? I think even Jordan Peterson would agree that there are differences. However, he characterizes them as, based on just simply, the differences between the sexes.
Yeah, can I add just somebody might argue that there are certain professions where there are biological reasons why more men or women go into them. Like some would point to, there's more women as kindergarten teachers and that work with kids, and some might say, well, that's not a gender pay difference. There's no disparity there, except it's just the differences in the sexes. And I'm curious, how would you respond to that sort of argument?
I mean, I think that, yes, women have gravitated towards certain professions, versus and men have gravitated towards other positions. But I think in all cases, there are men that become kindergarten teachers, and there's women that become fighter pilots, right? And then in those cases, are their salaries identical to each other? In some cases, yes, and in some cases, no. It depends on the setting. I think you find more, certainly government institutions, for instance, certain types of institutions, I think, lend themselves more to having more salary schedule where the salaries are the same. Corporations are much more flexible about salary.
Yeah, the difference between private and public.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's where there can be the disparities in income. But I think I'm talking to you too. You're a man. Jordan Peterson's a man. I mean, I think what men tend to discount is the way men look out for each other and are used to each other. So, for instance, in my career, I worked with a lot of men, and I was often.
Can you talk about the ratio, for instance, Marie?
Well, I mean, when I moved up into management, I was often the only woman.
And what was the proportion?
Well, like on my leadership teams, I mean, I was one of 5 to 10 on a leadership team, and I would be the only woman. And I would find myself in meetings with a lot of peers, and it could be 20 men, and I'm the only woman. And in working with men, I mean, it's difficult when you're the only, and I think this is the case for anyone that is the only one of a kind in
underrepresented group.
Yes, underrepresented group, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, this happens to lots of people in terms of ethnicity or even sexual orientation, where there's just a tendency of the majority group to speak a certain way, expect certain things culturally, how you interact with each other. To me, my experience was it was a good old boy network, and men were so comfortable patting each other on the back and having their little inside jokes, and it was all about stuff that men are interested in. Nothing I was interested in, but you just get along with that. Also, at the time when I was moving into those leadership positions, a lot of my peers that were men, if they had families, they had stay-at-home wives. So I would be, before I could even embark on my commute to get to work, I would be taking care of my daughter, getting her ready for preschool, taking her to preschool, peeling her off of me at preschool, and then driving to work. And here comes my boss or one of my peers, and they just got fed breakfast by their wives and didn't have to do anything with the kids. And that's the difference. I think that the really good thing in the present generation is where there's a lot more couples and families where both parties work and they play a little bit more of an equal role. Although
shared responsibility. Shared responsibility
to an extent. But most of my women still do the bulk of the taking care of the kids, in terms of even if they're in whatever childcare situation, there's always many things around running a household that women still do on top of their day jobs.
So you mentioned the good old boy network, and you probably have some specific examples of that. Is that the predominant reason why we see differences in pay schedules, especially, like I say, in the private sector? Is it really just men's comfort that allows them to write in contracts that say this salary will be for this person, but for a woman it'll be for this person? Is it the comfort level, or do you see other things that?
I mean, a key factor, and I've taught my daughter this, who's gotten very good at bypassing this, but a key factor in corporate salaries is what you're able to negotiate at the time when you're hired. And because that really dictates your upward trajectory, is the entry level salary that when you first start. And I think that there is a confidence gap there, as well as it's a shell game because a lot of times you don't know how much you can push on asking for a lot more. And again, I think that is where men tend to have the confidence factor.
So what if I play the devil's advocate right here and say that, well, then that's on women, and fault and their fault for not being more aggressive? What would you say to that?
I mean, it's again where women have to play the men's game. So in a male-dominated world, women have to succeed, they have to act more like men. And I think that's a shame because it's not a balanced way of looking at things.
How would things be different, for instance, if it was more like a woman who was
let me give you an example, because I was just reading an article the other day about a company that is run by a woman CEO. And in that case, they actually changed their interviewing process. So really to make it, and they ended up with, it's a software company. Well, it's kind of a software retail company. And they have a technical staff that's 35% women. That's really high for the tech industry because tech industry is very male dominated. But they changed how they went about and interviewed and evaluate candidates. And so when this is where, and in fact, also the company I work for, where they're trying to get people to understand bias. It's so important to understand how bias is it's just inherent, very invisible unless it's brought to your awareness.
Right. What did they do in this interview process that showed more sensitivity toward a woman candidate?
What they did is, instead of having in the application process, part of it was solving a technical problem all alone. And in their process, they paired the candidate who was applying with a non-technical staffer and collaborated. And that enabled them to find out more about a person's creativity, in fact, through a collaborative model than just a loner figure it out by yourself model. And so that's quite interesting because creativity, for instance, if you're looking for creativity is kind of hard to determine just through an application and interview process. So they've changed their process a bit, and as a result, they have been able to increase. They didn't do this through quotas or anything, but it enabled them to identify candidates that might not have otherwise been identified through.
Are you aware of any other techniques that they would do in their interview process?
Not specific. This was from an article, so I don't know. But I'm just saying this is an example about how a more diverse, more mixed gender setting might come up with different solutions to problems than a purely male-dominated workforce. And I mean, another example I can give you actually is that the company I work for actually is also has done a whole program to hire more people with autism into the workforce. And in that case, they changed their interview process in order to accommodate those that are autistic. Because the interview process, the traditional interview process was biased against people with autism.
And they probably wouldn't have known, it's like what you don't know that you don't know. Of course they couldn't, anticipate it because they don't see things through somebody's eyes like that.
Yeah. And I mean, and one of the things my understanding of some of what they've done is to give them more of a project to work on. I mean, a lot of times interviews are very much about the interpersonal connection and the communication, when the work itself, and some technical work does not require that much of that interpersonal connection because it's very highly technical work.
Marie, can I ask, maybe this will come up in the course of the interview, but can I ask, it would be really cool if we could see some specific examples of the discrimination you faced at the hands of the men you were working with in management or underneath.
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you, actually, this is kind of a funny example because it was done by women.
Oh no.
But there was
throwing us a curveball, are you?
Yeah, I'm just telling you that sexism occurs in all different ways, shapes, and forms,
We're all
But
ears.
the example that early on, fairly early on, I was at a supervisory level, and I applied for another department that I was quite interested in going to. And I was surprised. It was before I went on vacation. I found out that somebody that was just a technician in my department also applied for the same position. And it was a quite higher level position, something that I was much more at the right level for than he was. So I thought that was kind of cute, but it was a guy that applied for this position. And anyhow, it was a small department of women, and they didn't have any men in their department. And when I came back from vacation, I thought for sure I was going to get the job, because in fact I knew some people in that department, and in fact they had hired the guy. And purely because they didn't have any guys in the department.
That's interesting. How do you feel about that?
It was, it definitely threw me a curveball, and honestly, it was a sex discrimination suit if I would have wanted to take it anywhere, because I knew for a fact people that in that department told me they hired him because he was a man.
Right.
It was pure sex discrimination.
And you were clearly more qualified than he was.
I was more qualified.
What other episodes would you say that, like Jordan Peterson's analysis might, work in some cases, but, there's other factors at play. What else have you seen where you could say that, no, there's much more incidents here of just straight up discrimination and unequal treatment?
I think that it's, as a woman, especially when I worked with so many men, there was a lot of sexual harassment that occurred, not necessarily discrimination that I could prove.
It's always
subtle,
hard.
kind of more subtle. Okay.
Yeah. Discrimination is something that is pretty difficult to even be able to identify, especially when you're the person that's being discriminated against, because you need to you may know of other situations.
Right. Yeah, you need to have the smoking gun, and that's really hard to procure.
It's very hard to procure. That's why my example, I talked with people that told me, oh, we hired him because we wanted a guy.
But on the issues of sexual harassment, if you wouldn't mind going in, as sensitive as that is, that also is a window to kind of see that there's differences of treatment. And for that reason, it would be interesting to explore if you are willing to talk about some things that actually happened to you where you could easily see that, there was something very, very wrong or uncomfortable about the situation you were in.
Even if it was just a comment in a meeting, or an offhanded comment that was very sexist or discriminatory.
Well, I have to say, one of the things that would probably help me in working with so many men is I was raised with the two brothers who are immediately older than me. So I was kind of used to how guys are. But when I first started at Genentech, and I was just at the technician level, and nearly all of the other guys in the department, all the other people in the department were guys. There was one other woman at the time. And luckily, I got to be really good friends with one guy who really enlightened me a lot about how men think about women, which was very eye-opening for me, because I did not know how much at that time. And this was like the 80s, and I think people have evolved and changed, and I wouldn't imply this is the way that things are now. But
what would he tell you about?
Well, he would tell me that he would stand with other men and watch me walk down the hall, and and one would just say to the other, "Would you?" And the other guy would be like, "Oh yeah, I would. If I had a chance, I would." And you can understand what that was implied to mean. But
so this is a guy disclosing the way guys think.
This is the way guys think and talk. So this would not be said directly to me. It would be said behind my back, for instance. There was this one time, some of the scientists there were just very big egos. And I was in a lab situation with, of course, all men, all different men. And this scientist, he got really mad at me because I didn't have a hair cover over because we were in a environment where, you're supposed to wear hair. Sometimes people wear hair covers. I mean, literally the guy next to me, his hair was just as long as me,
Wow.
but he didn't need a hair cover. But I needed a hair cover.
That's a great example.
And it was clear that he directed his attention toward you.
Yeah. Probably the worst example that was very embarrassing for me was that I was in a meeting with pretty much all men because I had helped start up this large scale plant where we produced our product. And, the large scale plants in the biotech industry are quite similar to the chemical industry, lots of large tanks, piping, all that kind of stuff.
This was like off-site at some other place, like land that you had purchased and
it was in the building that we were bringing online for large-scale production. As our products got bigger, you have to make more, and so your scale gets larger. And I had helped, and that's always a big startup situation, to start up a new plant and test all the equipment and get everything in place. So there was a party to kind of reward me and two other guys who had been on loan from different departments to help that startup effort. And they gave everybody like a bottle of whiskey, but I got an extra present. And the present was this mug that said, and they had me open it, of course, in front of all the guys, show everybody what it said, which said, "I'd walk a mile for that thing you do with your tongue." And I was so embarrassed. I was the only woman.
How many people, what was the ratio?
There was probably 20 guys from, managers up to the vice president. And they all had a big laugh about how funny that was. And there I was, what do I do?
Now, were there any guys, I'm just curious, were there any guys in situations like that pushed back and said, guys, this isn't cool, or did everyone kind of go along?
After the meeting, I did talk to one guy, and I was like, "Who got that for me?" And he told me who got it for me, which was my boss. And he said, "That was pretty bad, huh?" And I was like, "Yeah." Now that boss, I have to tell you too, that Anita Hill and what she did during the Clarence Thomas hearings made a huge difference in the workforce. And I don't know that people, because it was quite a while ago when that happened, when those hearings were held. But that boss, after the Anita Hill hearings, said to me later on, "I guess what I did was kind of like sexual harassment, huh?" And I was like, "Yeah," yes, that was it. And after the Anita Hill hearings, these are actually when, at least, at the corporation I worked, where they started doing training around what sexual harassment is. It had not been discussed. I mean, I think it made a huge impact. Companies started paying attention that they actually had a responsibility to not have that kind of environment that was tolerated.
And not to beat an old horse here, do you have other remembrances of just things that were awkward and painful, and that that's of this sort? Before we move on to other things, I just want to give you opportunities here.
I mean, I think that was the worst one. I mean, I think it happens so frequently, and I honestly, until the company started saying this was wrong, I just, as a woman, figured I just had to suck it up and deal with it, and I certainly wasn't going to make a big deal about or a big stink about anything, because I knew that was not in my best interest in terms of my career. So, I mean, I think that's what lots of people do. I mean, what are you going to do?
Right. I mean, in whatever field that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So, and you were typically the only female. It was not like you could collaborate with other women, kind of check your impressions with. It seems like you were pretty alone at Genentech, and then you were also at Abgenix, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think what I did over the course of my career, I mean, at that time in the 80s and 90s, I was the only woman, but it did start changing in that there were more women over time. And I like to think that I know that there were women that looked up to me for having been at the level that I was so that they felt like they could also move into the kinds of positions that I had. So I think it's always helpful wherever someone goes. So the work environment, when it's hostile in that way to women, I mean, it takes some women to go in there and do it anyhow. And women have been doing that across the board in lots of fields.
No, of course. Now, did women, once you were kind of like, I guess, a little bit more senior in terms of your work experience, did you find women would seek you out and tell you about some of the, experiences that they were going through?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yes. For an example, I took over a department at one point that had been under a man for years and years. I mean, there weren't that many female leaders. Literally, within the first week of me being in charge of that department, I had a woman in my office telling me about sexual harassment by the previous boss.
Right. Once she could come to you.
When she could come to me. And that department had been run that same way by that same guy for probably 10 years. So, yeah, I mean, I think women are more comfortable talking about these things with other women because until that happens, as long as there's a certain work environment that's, whether men are aware of it or not, if there's not any conduit for women to be able to complain, then those kind of hostile work environments will continue to exist.
Right, and be underreported.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you don't have anywhere to go. So
yeah, right.
I mean, like I said, she was in my office the first week, and there had been some pretty bad harassment that had been taking place for quite a long time.
So you're saying that discrimination per se is really hard to explain, especially if there's like pay differences, because who knows like how human resources is parceling out one payment to one person and the reasons why. I mean, it's difficult to maybe know how it's happening. We probably have a record to say, well, it is happening. There's differences in pay here, but whether they can attribute it to some kind of actual policy of discrimination. But on the other level, where discrimination has another face of sexual harassment, you would characterize your experience as being something that was daily, just environmental. In other words, it was saturated right within the environment. Would you say that that's true? Something that you were always impacted by?
Well, I mean, yeah, it was just part of the culture. It was just interwoven. I mean, I think I got to a point where when I first got in that environment, I just figured there was nothing that I could do about it. It was what it was. It was only when I was at higher level positions where I could speak up about it. Once I developed enough of you have to develop your reputation and a name for yourself that people respect what you have to say before you can really say things.
Right. Marie, knowing you as I do, and your background, your intelligence, your capabilities, what did you find when you might have been actually smarter and more capable than the people that you were working with? What would happen on those levels?
Again, like anybody that's an underrepresented person in a certain environment, you do have to prove yourself over and over. I mean, you have to be like at 150% of your peers. When I think back of the men that I saw who were really very mediocre.
And sloppy.
Yeah, and yet they would get promotion after promotion. And part of it was I can think of this one guy in particular. He was an engineer, but he commuted with a couple of the senior people. So they were buds, talked every day. The work was not anything, like I say, it was mediocre work, but he got promoted just all the time. I think that's pervasive. People have relationships and I think this is always something that, quite honestly, I think human resources departments do try to work on making the work environment fair, but it's always a work in progress. It reflects the culture of the corporation, and there are corporations and work environments that it's more important. Their values are such that it's more important to them to make things fair, and there are other work environments where that's not a value and it's not that important to the leadership. to make it fair and to ensure that there's not bias. It takes leadership to take on these kinds of challenges and confront them and think of how to combat them and make things more fair. That leadership isn't always there. Leadership is lacking from lots of places.
Yeah. Marie, were you ever targeted in terms of being a troublemaker, just a perception that you might have felt as being, oh my God, she's at it again? Did you ever get any kind of experience like that?
I did have, it makes me laugh because I am kind of a troublemaker. So what can I say? I had a very clear sense of what I think is right and wrong. I was actually in that same situation where I was helping start up that plant. The guy that was originally in charge of that plant was someone I had reported to previously and was, in my mind, a terrible manager and leader. And when I got to the plant, there was a lot of things going wrong with it. That
were just falling through the cracks?
Yeah.
Just for my curiosity here, what was this plant developing? What kind of medication or...
at that time we had a new product that was for heart attack victims, for dissolving the blood clot when somebody gets a heart attack.
Yeah, so you guys were like on a big payday when Genentech was doing really well. I mean, these were drugs that could be like real rainmakers. I mean, so the pressure.
Yeah, I mean, it in a way, at that time of Genentech, it was still really it hadn't achieved huge monetary success. It was still on its climb up to that because it was a lot of things were being done for the first time. Yeah, I mean, at that time, there was the big pharmaceutical companies that had all of these drugs that were based on chemicals, but Genentech was really the first biopharmaceutical where the drugs were being made using the recombinant DNA technology and where there's a biological system in which originally creates the proteins or whatever, and then are purified and things for medication. So, but you were asking me about the troublemaker thing, so I was just going to say that when I saw how badly things were happening in that plant, and the head of the plant, his boss, was the one that had put him in that position. So I went over that guy's head. So I basically went over two people's heads to the guy above them, and I told him what I saw. Actually, me and two other people. It was three of us. I remember getting pulled into what happened is they did end up replacing that guy with somebody else that was better. But at the same time, the one of the guys whose heads I went over, he pulled me in his office and he told me, "Don't ever do that again," in no uncertain terms, and because I had gone over his head and I made him look bad. I mean, there was so much at stake, I felt, for the company at the time that it was just not going to be successful if they allowed that to continue.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Marie, these reflections are really, really great. It's like what we really wanted to hear from you. But knowing you as I do, I know that you have a Buddhist philosophy, and I'm wondering if you could talk to us, because we have a philosophy podcast, and some of our listeners will be interested in philosophical topics.
Can I add when you're done?
And so I'm wondering if there have been ethical stands that you've taken, in the corporate world based on your Buddhist philosophy.
I would just add this as well, Marie, is that you're clearly a very capable, intelligent person who's hard in the sense that you can deal with a lot of these issues. And what's sad about that is that other women who go through them may not be able to deal with it, because it's such an uneven playing field, as you've been saying. And so I would imagine that relates to Buddhism in some way, because Buddhism, of course, teaches you to be at peace with yourself and to be able to handle external situations. And so I would just add that into Alejandro's question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was drawn to Buddhism from a very young age, 12 or 13, and didn't actively pursue it until later in my life. But I was always it just resonated for me. In my experience as I moved up, and I think this is something for younger people to really consider as they look at their career choices. As I moved up in the biopharmaceutical world, I got much closer to the business decisions that were being made. And when it comes to something like medicine, which is for people's health, and combining that with a business perspective, which is a profit motive, there becomes a conflict. I became more exposed to the decisions that are made at the top about drug development and what drugs are developed and what isn't, and what companies do to enamor the stock market and the shareholders. And those decisions, which are not, the decision-making process is not typically public at all. You only see the outcome of those decisions. I became increasingly uncomfortable with seeing how those decisions got made. I mean, when I was at Genentech, actually, and I took a class, I was always taking classes on the side, and I was taking a class on ethical issues in management. It was part of I was starting to think about maybe getting a master's in organizational leadership. I ended up writing a paper about the ethical issues around the pricing of pharmaceuticals. The pricing of pharmaceuticals, it's a dirty business. Like, there's no way that, this is my opinion, of course, and I'm sure pharmaceutical executives would disagree with it, and I know that, but in my opinion, the decisions that are made around the price of a pharmaceutical, a lot of it has to do with what the market will bear, how much, especially life-saving medicines, what are people willing to pay for their life?
Right.
Those are.
Do you remember any drug in particular that might have, been particularly stick out in your mind that?
Well, I can tell you every drug that when you look at the pricing, none of the pricing decision has anything to do with the needs of the people for this drug.
Yeah, there's no humanistic value there.
There's not a lot of humanistic value. What pharmaceutical companies may do is they may create programs for low-income people to still get access to the drug. But the price will have a lot more to do with what the market will bear. Anyhow, there's lots of factors, but it's not pretty. And I went to that same VP I complained about that other plant. I went to that same guy because I was encouraged by someone in human resources to go talk to him about the paper I'd written. And at the time, they were doing a trial to really prove that their drug was superior to another drug. And I started talking to him. Look, I said, really, I did some research on this, and the way in which pharmaceuticals are even prescribed, patients don't have a choice. Their doctors are saying you should take this drug. And he said, so are you thinking that after we do this trial, and if we show that our drug is superior, that we should actually lower the price? And I said, yes, I think that would be great. Lower the price.
That's you, Marie, so out of step.
And then he was very polite. He was like, thank you very much for your opinion.
Do you still have that paper, Marie?
I don't know. I don't know if I do, Alex.
That would be, just, of course, just purely an aside, I would love to see it. But Marie, in terms of like your Buddhist philosophy, your background, how did that concretely help you to kind of make decisions? Because I think that the background was that you eventually moved away from that pharmaceutical world.
I worked at a couple more biotech companies after that, but really, as I just got to a point where in Buddhism there's the Eightfold Path, and one of the parts of the Eightfold Path is right livelihood, and I just felt that there was a conflict between my feeling about right livelihood and working for companies that make the kinds of decisions they do, particularly about pricing.
And that was really an ethical principle in your head that made you feel like you needed to take an action.
Yeah, I realized I just wasn't comfortable any longer in that industry. because of the way it's the profit motive.
And the money must have been good for you back then too, Marie.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised that I could. I mean, I had an opportunity to transition into high tech and pretty much maintain my salary, which was great that I could do that.
Yeah, right. So in other words, even though you were making an ethical decision, your skill set allowed you to kind of still land on your feet.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the best of both worlds. You can an ethical decision and you're still employable.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't necessarily know that kind of unfolded to my great luck that turned out to work. And I mean, I'm pretty adaptable, so I can figure things out in lots of different environments. And I was just going to mention, like I worked at a community clinic for a year and a half, a completely different environment. But, a lot of my skill set is pretty transferable to lots of different settings.
Right, because you have background in a lot of things, management and the tech world as well.
How did your Buddhist background help you on a day-to-day basis? Because, Buddhism sort of teaches you to not take things as personally and to kind of, one of the principles behind Buddhism is interconnectedness, that we're all one. And there's the meditation practice. Was there a way in which your practice of Buddhism helped you to deal with the daily sexism that you experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that at the time when I was experiencing a lot more what I'm talking about in terms of sexism and sexual harassment was before I would really consider myself that much of a practicing Buddhist. My Buddhism it's really deepened over the last 10, 15 years.
Right. So in the first part of your career, it was just basically you're a survivalist, survival mode. I've got to make it here. I've got a family. And
Yeah. What helped me a lot, and I'd certainly, and what helped me at some pivotal points was actually therapy. I had some situations at work that if I wouldn't have been in therapy, it would have been a lot harder to manage, particularly around, I had some pretty terrible bosses, and I also had a pretty difficult father, so just navigating the world where you see repeating patterns, it's helpful to get insights from.
I'm assuming that they were male bosses?
Yeah.
And were there things that they exhibited in their behavior which would be typical of males, and and what were you seeing with these other bosses that you're describing?
Certainly, some of those men had terrible interpersonal skills and lack of compassion or concern for individuals. I think that at that time the company was quite young still, and leadership skill and ability, interpersonal skills were not valued at that time. And as the company grew and matured, those types of individuals were not as successful. So I think in general, what my take was that in any specialized industry where there's a limited number of people with the skills you need, the technical skills, a lot of times a lack of interpersonal skills is tolerated much more because you need the technical skills that the person brings.
Yeah, the wonky scientist with his lab coat, he's kind of out of touch, but you need him for your business.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that happens in lots of technical industries where there's a small set of people that have the technical knowledge you need. And so you don't have the leverage to get them to get more educated about how to be better interpersonally.
Yeah. How do you tend to feel when you run into women that have, personality types that where you see things that would almost be masculine, and especially when we're talking about negative masculine attributes? Do you see that, for instance?
I haven't seen that as much, quite honestly, although I know that women, and I know what I realized at a certain point was that if I wanted to get to the next level, I would have to change myself so much to be like a competitive, male, aggressive sort of personality that I didn't want to do it.
Yeah. That's what Jordan Peterson basically says in his defense, that this is not always owing to pure sexism, is that men are willing to be ugly in the pursuit of money, and women, for a lot of reasons, tend to be more humanistic and not willing to completely lose themselves in a corporate world.
Well, I think that if you look at more mature corporations, for instance, and organizations, they typically see that there's lots of detrimental effects by that very aggressive male kind of character that is bad for business, quite honestly. So typically more mature organizations wouldn't want. Depends. I mean, maybe there's some fields where
who knows, in the financial fields or maybe in law or in government. I mean, there could be a lot of places in which, those personalities or types are still really predominant. So,
but when I managed departments, I found that the workforce, the people that were on my team, when I had a better balance between the two genders, it just made for a much better work environment. Either direction. I mean, Alex knows. My husband, he works in as a teacher, and it's a very female-dominated arena. And I just think balance is just something that is really a positive for a lot of aspects of work. Having a balance between genders and having diversity in your staff, it's better and it's stronger because when you have more diverse viewpoints, especially as a leader, I always liked having more diverse viewpoints. It gave me more ability to consider options and choices.
Absolutely. Marie, and kind of like to bring us full circle, what kind of trends do you see these days, would give you some hope in terms of like workplaces that are trying to move toward more equality and egalitarianism?
I'm very hopeful about the millennial generation. I mean, I think that there's a lot more egalitarianism between men and women in the younger generations, which is fantastic.
I see it too.
Absolutely.
We both see it. I mean, we see millennials, of course, and this is going to be a podcast that a lot of 18, 19, 20-year-old students are going to listen to because we're going to promote it. And we typically see that in our classrooms all the time. Is that millennials tend to be way more tolerant,
extremely tolerant,
way more tolerant, way more less serious about taking themselves so seriously. Their body types, their anxieties, their phobias. They're much more able to talk about, having issues, being depressed, being despondent, not knowing what their future is. I see it. Don't you see that too?
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we ask people to write little private 1-minute papers all the time to get a little assessment of what the classroom is thinking about a particular issue. And millennials, I mean, whatever criticism that they take, the snowflakes and the microaggressions, these horrible characterizations that everybody makes about them, I see them as having tremendous upside. They've been given a bad deck of cards.
Yeah, that's what often doesn't get appreciated is there's sort of a culture of scarcity, and college is getting more and more competitive with fewer and fewer places to go to college and then to get a job after. So millennials are dealing with this in a way that previous generations did not.
Yeah, and I find them much more communicative. But what do you see also in terms of you were talking about millennials that are hopeful in terms of trends?
When you look at the trends, also in terms of women penetrating various areas in greater numbers, and I mean, certainly the most recent election is very positive in terms of women moving into political positions.
You're talking about the House of Representatives, how the numbers really increased a lot. Yeah.
In state legislatures too, there's still a long way to go, but the more, I think in most areas you see as it's an upward trend. It's not going to just go back down, I don't think.
No, I mean, no. I think the toothpaste is out of that tube. I don't think we're going back. And I think the country's at a place right now where it's just so uncomfortable because we're fighting this new battle of where people who have been marginalized are now having this voice, and that's why there's so much ridicule from certain sectors of society that they must punish this new group of people that's aware of their differences and aware that they need to have a voice, and that's why you see so much ridicule of people when they complain.
Really, I know that it may be threatening to some men as they see more and more women that they have to compete with. But by the same token, I think men are also seeing the opportunities available to them where perhaps they don't have to be the main breadwinner. Maybe the partner can, and perhaps they can have more involvement in their child's lives. It's a huge difference for children to really have both parents involved in their lives. So I hope that men, as they see the world changing in terms of more women in different positions of leadership and power and things, that they also see the tremendous positive benefit they have to, move into careers that maybe have been dominated. I mean, I know when I've been in hospital settings and there's male nurses, I mean, it's great. So I'm always very complimentary to male nurses for them doing that. It's not easy being one of the few of a certain gender in a certain field, but some people start there and more get into it, and things balance out, and it'll be better for everybody.
That really illustrates the problem is, this it's systemic on some level, and this is a problem. This problem of gender, I mean, it affects men in a sort of indirect way as well.
Right. I mean, look, the toxic images that we have to have of being the breadwinner, of putting our health and our mental sanity at risk because of all these things. And, we all stand to gain when women become more educated, more empowered.
Yeah.
Those are our partners, potentially.
Yep. And I mean, and they've showed this in global development that countries where women get education is the most important thing
For the development of the country.
So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
it's a really important factor, and it's really to the betterment of humanity.
Yeah. And I think what a nice kind of a note to close on. Marie, I want to reintroduce your name again to our audience. Marie Delahaye from the Bay Area, a good friend of mine for many, many years. And this was just a real nice, joyful even opportunity for us to talk to you, get your voice out there. And thank you for speaking with us today about these issues and your insights in the kind of like in the belly of the beast.
Thanks so much, Marie. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity, you guys.
We thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
All right.
Bye, Marie. Bye.
Bye.